Today, we have a very important conversation to be had, which is the result of the documents that were put together at last week's two very important meetings in Beijing. I'm here in Beijing, and so is one of my guests, Dr. John Gong, and another guest, Professor Bert Hofman, is joining us from Singapore. He's the director of the East Asia Institute at the National University of Singapore. Both professors, academics, both economists, have a very strong contribution to make to the conversation we need to have today. We want to be able to decipher some of the implications and some of the long-term issues that the rest of us have to incorporate into our thinking as we imagine and try to make sense of China that is maturing into a sustainable economy. The documents that were put together last week, the 14th five-year plan for national economic and social development for 2021 to 2025, and a very interesting document called the Long-Range Objectives through the year 2035. This is a new document in that it tries to project China's growth economic priorities for another 15 years. This was not done before, but it's a draft document. It's a document written in pencil to sort of outline the priorities that the country will have. Some introductory comments that I'd like to make is this, that every time these centrally planned documents were put together in the past, I think the rest of the world did not take them as seriously as we should have. Central planning was discredited many years ago by the way in which it was managed in other economies. But I think China has come to a point where the process, the two consultative forums that were put together to validate this documentation and validate the thinking of this documentation are highly representative of the feel of the ground and both accountable as well as democratic in that there is a buy-in process by the respective stake owners in the system. And so you would see that at least the five-year plans are actually distilled down to the provincial and the local levels, where the key performance indicators of the local administrators are aligned with the objectives that are put together. If you had missed the importance of this process in the growth that China has seen since it joined the WTO in 2001, you would have missed the tremendous growth that it has been able to put together. The difference between all that China has achieved from 2001 to today has been mostly in the physical realm, in the buildings, in the infrastructure, and so on. And the feature of the 14th five-year plan and also the long-term objectives is that it's starting to focus more on the soft aspects of the economy, skill sets, salaries, wages, productivity, and so on. And also, of course, the environment and making sure that it is a sustainable economy. I have with me two professors who have been wrapping their minds around the issues that we are confronted with, both domestically for China and all of us who are counterparties of China in one way or another, whether we run businesses, we are part of the financial system, or we are entire economies looking at China and trying to make sense of our own place in a new world where China is an engine of growth for the rest of the world. So I'm going to start by inviting Professor Bert Hofman to sort of outline for us what his thoughts are in terms of what we need to be looking at. And then I'll ask Professor John Gong to tell us what his priorities are. And then I will start to decipher it and plonk in my priorities, the issues that I see speaking to people on the ground here in Beijing, but also with a good sense of what the rest of us need to be paying attention to. So Bert, would you like to start for us? Now I'm very interested to hear what are the priorities that you've made sense of the final documents that were put together.
Thanks for your kind introduction. The plan is indeed a very good strategic document, and if you are governing a 1.4 billion people economy, you have to pull together some sort of a unified vision, and that's the plan. So it is no longer a plan as in the old planned economy. It is a strategic plan, and in that sense, it has a very good function. Second, I think that the highest priority for China's government is no longer growth, but it is the quality of growth. If I were to summarize the whole plan in one word, it's quality of growth. I.e. moving away from a heavy emphasis on the quantity of growth. Yes, it's still there, and implicitly there is still a growth target for the next 5-year plan, but explicitly it's no longer there, which is quite significant. It just says that from year to year we'll set a growth target, but no longer for the whole of the 5 years. Xi Jinping, he gave an interview last year after a big party meeting on the plan, and he said, look, by 2035, I would not be surprised if we can still double our economy. That's how he put it. And that would mean for the long term, still a relatively high growth, i.e. It literally translates into 4.75% growth per year for the next 15 years. So that's still a relatively ambitious target. And there's some issues that China needs to work on. For the next 5 years, I said there's emphasis to the quality of growth. It was already a little bit there in the 13th 5-year plan, but it has been reinforced now. And the big new thing is the dual circulation strategy. It's important for people to know that term because it will come back for many, many more times. Whereas basically the thinking earlier was, look, we rely more on the external circulation, we rely on exports, we rely on foreign investment for growth. We now are shifting the priority to the domestic circulation. So there will be more emphasis on domestic demand, and particularly consumption. There will be more emphasis on domestic supply chains, particularly in critical supply chains, such as integrated circuits and other sensitive areas, if you want. And there will be more emphasis on what China calls indigenous innovation or domestic innovation by Chinese. It's, to some extent, this is what's happening when a country gets richer. So that this is not that should not put it as, if you want, alarm bells ringing or a protectionist direction of China. No, this is what happens if China, once a country gets richer. And so you become less trade dependent, you start innovating more at home, and it's what Japan went through, it's what the United States went through when they got richer in the 19th century. So there's, in that sense, it is quite normal. But of course, these are circumstances, the circumstances, external circumstances are a bit special this year, and in the drafting of the plan, there is tensions between China and the United States, and so there is a concern that from China's side that they might not have access to critical technologies, so they want to make them at home. And second, China looks at how the rest of the world has managed COVID, and they don't see much of a strong rebound in growth in the rest of the world, so that external demand will also be less. So also from a more practical point of view, this dual circulation strategy will help China grow over the next 5 years.
Those are your top line points. John, would you like to get in there and add your perspective? Especially you are in Beijing and you're quite associated with some of the the people who attend these two conferences.
Thank you, Daniel, for the invitation. First of all, this is a very long document, 140-some pages. A tome, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm in total agreement with what Bert has said so far. It really emphasizes, innovation, indigenous innovation, stuff like that. But in addition to this, I want to also mention two things. One is that this document is basically a vision document. It lays out a whole bunch of targets, unlike some of the older 5-year plans that have set out very detailed targets and also things how to do this. And it's not like that. It's really a vision document in my view. So call it planning or not, really doesn't matter. I mean, it sets out a goal of basically elevating China to a modern society. And I put it very bluntly, I think it's a modern society, both in terms of economic metrics, but also all other types of metrics reflecting different aspects of a modern society. I want to mention two things in addition to what Bert has said. One is that this very much reflects President Xi's central theme of a people-centered growth agenda. If you look at the targets set out in this document, pages and pages are devoted to a lot of sort of social welfare type of targets for things like education, medical care, environment, all these things. Now, these things are not so much quantitative in nature, but it just describes a lot of the nice things that you would expect of a modern society. So this also resonates very well with a very popular phrase these days in Beijing, in political circles in Beijing, which is called the new development concept. What does new development concept mean? I know there's new development. Development really means a GDP target. Now, it doesn't even mention the real target. Okay, other than he said that trying to double the economy within 15 years or so. But it talks about other aspects of growth that are directly relevant to people's lives, about housing, for example, about urbanization, about medical care, about the number of kindergartens for a certain number of population, right? I mean, these are the very concrete things that are directly relevant to people's life. So, my first impression is that this would definitely create a lot of opportunities in the service sector. I mean, all the things he's talking about, these sort of people relevant aspects of a new growth model, they're all very much service oriented, right? Service oriented. So certainly, in my view, China is moving towards a direction of modern society that's heavily service centric. For example, if you compare the size of the medical sector in the United States as a percentage of GDP compared with China, right? There's no comparison, okay? So clearly, China is moving towards that direction, okay? So this is one thing I want to emphasize. Second thing is, I think this 14th five-year plan is, I think for the first time, it really mentions these two independence kind of ideas. One is food security. The other one is energy security. I think these are quite new concepts. I mean, they haven't really talked about. I mean, what does that mean? I keep thinking about why that's so important, right? Well, I think behind this two security concepts, I think there's a quite strong signal that China is probably prepared for the worst, and that's a very significant development in my view. We have never had any problem with food security. I think for the first time, these two securities represent major opportunities, but I think it sends out a very strong political signal. And also, I think probably has some strong implications for the energy global market in the future. That China, I don't think China is going to be massively reliant upon imports. You're going to see, the country has a plan of to be robust and to be resilient towards any future actions in the energy market from other countries. That's the two things that I have in mind that I want to add.
Well, thank you very much for that, John, because I had looked through the document. Actually, you're right, they are incredibly large document. They read like a 3-year or 4-year degree program in governance or in statehood. Every chapter is very detailed. And thank you for that comment on energy and food security. In fact, the long-range document just puts one of the most important goals that it set itself to be carbon neutral by 2060 and to peak carbon emission by 2035. And you're right, they sort of veer away from setting GDP growth targets. But let me draw on both of you on a number of themes that I thought warrant a discussion or your general idea or your input. GDP growth. What was very interesting during the sessions was that Li Keqiang found himself having to defend that this year they will do 6%. And the media was asking him again and again, are you sure 6%? And he said, yeah, I'm sure it's 6%. Given the several human capital themes that are in these documents, wage increase, and as John has pointed out, the rural-urban growth and sustainability, rural vitalization, that is, healthcare, education, kindergartens, and all that. Of course, the consumption economy. If you take these soft themes, which are different from infrastructure-based growth that defined the last 20 years, what sort of GDP growth should be expecting China to be galloping at or trotting at in order to achieve these things? As economists and as people have seen other societies evolve, where general income goes up, and then that has to be tapered off with productivity, and then expectations go up, healthcare, education. How do you think that scenario is going to play out in China in the next 5 years or the foreseeable future? I noticed that China introduced social security a few years ago, and then insurance and so on. So the services component of personal wealth is increasing in that regard, coupling with consumption. Talk to us through a little bit. How do you think that's going to play out?
First of all, speaking of the GDP growth this year, Premier Li actually said above 6%. That's what he said. And
he did.
Yeah, and the journalists were pretty much pressing him that it should be more than that. I think there's a quite wide consensus that China is likely to achieve something way better than 6%. I think, and it's actually not quite surprising because last year was horrible, right? And
2%, right? Yeah, 2.3%.
Yes, and historically. Right after the pandemic, something like this, the economics tend to be bouncing back very strongly. For example, after the 1918-1919 Spanish flu, the United States, experienced a very long stretch of growth, high growth, for over 10 years, actually, all the way up until 1930s depression, Great Depression. And I think this is going to happen among better off economies, more advanced, richer countries, basically. And usually after a natural disaster, the great countries doing even better, the poor countries sort of linger. And I would put China into the category with the other more advanced economies at this point. But typically, after a strong recovery, the first and second year after the pandemic, things will taper off and then sort of, slow down substantially in the future, but still doing very well. I want to mention two theories relevant to this, GDP forecast. One is that, in economics, we have this convergence theory. In other words, as the economy does much better, as China becomes part of the developed world, even though this is still very controversial, you're not going to see the kind of growth rates typically that we saw in the in the last 10 years or so. Inevitably, things are going to slow down. Things have been slowing down at this point, right? So you look at the typical developed world annual growth rate, 2 or 3%. It's very good growth, actually, right? So sooner or later, China is going to move into that world. That's going to be the norm for China. The question is how long it's going to take. How long can China sustain 6%, even 5%, 4% in the next 15 years before it moves into that world? So this is one theory. China is converging to the growth rate that is typical of the developed world. Second is the demographic change. On top of the slowdown growth, China's population is going to peak. It's not already peaking. You're going to see quite significant drop in population size in the next 10 to 15 years. And that has a significant impact on the economy. We all know what's happened to Japan, for example. These are major challenges. The question is how fast that China's economic growth rate is going to slow down. And that's anybody's wild guess. My own view is that for the next 10 years, it's probably still going to be above 4%, hopefully. By the end of the next decade, if China is still able to maintain above 4%, that's already a tremendous achievement. And that surpassing the United States within the next 10 years, I think, right? There's a 30% difference in economic size at this point.
Very good top line points. Let's ask Bert to jump in there with his comments, and then we'll add them up.
All right. Well, the reason why people think that 6% is actually a very low target is that it's already in the bag. If you have the last quarter of last year and China would not grow from that point, it would give 6% annual growth. So in that sense, it's going to be more. The market consensus is around 8, and that sounds about right. With the US stimulus, which is very positive for the rest of the world, it might actually be a little bit higher now that the stimulus has come through, which adds 1 percentage point growth to the world. It adds 3 percentage points to the US, but 1 percentage point to the world, it might actually be a little bit higher, because I think the expectations in drafting the government reports was we're not going to get that much growth from the outside world. That may yet change. In the medium term, we're looking for the next 5 years of our estimate of potential growth rate. That's what a concept economists use, of around 5%. And the way to look at that is to sort of say, how much can you get out of investment? How much do you get out of the increase in the labor force, or in this case, it's a decrease in the labor force? And how much can you expect in productivity increases? And then if you add that up, sort of based on historical experience, you come to sort of around 5%. It's not a very solid estimate, and frankly, it's hard to pin these things down, especially productivity. One of the key problems in China's economy has been total factor productivity, as economists call it. But it's not just China, it's been around the world. Ever since the global financial crisis, productivity increases have come down. So despite all the innovation, despite the great Fintech and other stuff going on in China, it doesn't seem to translate that much into economy-wide productivity. One key reason is that there's still quite a few protective sectors in China. And so the exit of firms is not that easy in China. And so despite the fact that a number of companies doing very well, a lot of non-performing or weak performing companies still hang on, and therefore productivity levels overall don't increase that much. Again, that's not just a China problem. With loose monetary policies around the world, you see the zombie companies becoming a phenomenon worldwide. And so 5% growth for potential growth for the coming 5-year plan seems quite okay. But as John said, that it might further level off as China becomes richer, as China becomes high income. The implicit target in Xi Jinping's growth of doubling GDP is really quite ambitious at 4.75.
Macroeconomic tools that are available to China to taper that and to counter global forces. What are the tools available to them? I noticed in the working papers when they were referring to the deficit budget, China tends to refer to it on a year-to-year deficit to GDP rather than deficit to spending. What other tools are available to a country like China that is different from, say, the US or other countries in the region that we can expect them to be using?
China have used its macroeconomic tools, fiscal policy, monetary policy, quite extensively last year. But also there is one key constraint on the use of those tools, and that is the debt to GDP ratio, where that's now really quite high for a country of China's income levels. It's going to 300%. Last year, it was added 24 percentage point from 272 to 296. So that's becoming a little tricky, and China realizes that. So actually the aim of monetary policy is to stabilize this. And so monetary policy is constrained from that point of view, and fiscal policy to some extent, because the overall government deficit is planned to go down as a share of GDP. And therefore, it contributes to the stabilization of the debt levels. One thing that China has done very well, and really has as an additional point, is to not just have a broad monetary policy, but to target that monetary policy, i.e., the central bank opening up specific credit or discount windows where banks can come with particular kinds of loans to get a discount rate. And on small and medium enterprises, it is on green finance, is on some of the government priorities that, if you want, there is green quantitative easing and there's SME quantitative easing, which is quite unique to China, can be quite powerful.
But at the same time, what's interesting is the government has been quite determined in trying to demonstrate a kind of a balance between funding state-owned enterprises versus small enterprises and private enterprises. And on top of that, lately there's been a push towards engendering foreign investments as part of the overall capital mix. And they tend to be contradictory policies. On the one hand, it seems that the state wishes that the most important progress in technology and so on are made by state-owned enterprises, but they're not. They're made by the private sector. And then even for foreign capital, it's actually directed at specific industries, as you said. Talk to us a little bit about these contradictions and how do you see them being managed, or are they contradictions?
I'm not sure, it's contradiction. I don't think the central government has a policy of, particularly favoring one type of enterprises versus other. At least this is very true at the provincial and local level. In China, what's very unique is that the competition is not so much driven by the central government, but really by the regional and local and provincial governments. And these governments really don't care SOE or you are a foreign company or a private company. They all treat you very well. It's a mixed picture, even though the central government in a way sort of reflect President Xi's strong faith in the legion of SOEs, right? I mean, he has a very famous saying about this. But if you look at what's really happening in the market, I don't think there are very strong sort of domestic policies in supporting these companies. Probably on the international stage, if you look at the companies that are really heavily involved in the BNR initiative, for example, I would say the vanguards of most of these companies are state-owned enterprises. They're probably supported, by various policies from the central government. But in domestic markets, it's all over the place. And let me put it this way: the competition in China is mostly between municipal governments in China, and it's fierce. They come up with all kinds of policies, funds in support of the companies that are creating jobs and tax revenues for their local jurisdiction. I don't think they have a strong preference of one type of company versus the other. So investment are welcome. There's no such thing as an SOE investment or foreign investment. Investment is investment. It does wonderful things. Yeah. It's all welcome.
I've experienced talking to banks. Their experience is something like this, especially the banks with the national charter. Their loan books are all filled up by January every year. They're given a target of 30% year-on-year growth on loans. By the end of January, they've distributed their loans to the state-owned enterprises. And then they start worrying about small businesses and so on. And in fact, we sometimes have conversations with banks saying, okay, now that we have been directed by the government to go out and look out for small businesses, how do we even start the process? We don't have the risk management capability, and the ticket size is too small for the kind of books that we have. This thing about access to credit for small businesses is still an issue in China. State-owned banks already well configured with the state-owned enterprises. That transition to giving more access to small businesses is still work in progress. It's still in its early days.
You're absolutely right. This is an issue with respect to the size of the borrower as opposed to the nature of the borrower. This is a universal problem. I mean, banks don't like to make loans to small companies. I mean, it's true everywhere, I guess. It's because of the cost structure, because of the risk factor. So this is actually nothing new. Bert made a very good point about China's central bank has a meticulously designed scheme of providing incentives for the banks to make specific loans to a specific type of company. And I think, this is a very cleverly concocted plan. Whether it has been successful or not, or whether it creates a problem for the banks from a risk factor, whether it really helps these small companies, that I'm not sure. I haven't seen sort of strong evidence that this is really working. This is a commercial bank's problem. They just don't want to make loans to small companies. That's a fundamental statement, I would say.
Let me add to this and a couple of observations. One is, it is true that there is a disproportionate share of loans going to state enterprises versus private enterprises if you look at the overall size in the economy. But to some extent, that is also because there's a differentiation in industries. State enterprises are more in heavy industries compared to private enterprises. So you can sort of more capital intensive. So there's some explanation there. Unfortunately, state enterprises in general have lower returns, and there are some issues with that allocation. But second, the large state banks, the centrally owned banks, Structured Bank of China, they take in disproportionate amount of the deposits, but then of the loans, actually it's less so. So they, on net, they lend through the interbank market through hundreds of smaller banks that are dependent on the interbank market for their funding. Now, those banks have better channels to small and medium enterprises. But the third, and that's the big question outstanding at the moment, China had solved the problem, or not China, and finance had solved the problem of access to small and medium enterprises, i.e. with the enormous database from transactions in e-commerce, suddenly they had expanded massively the access to finance of small and medium enterprises. What the regulatory changes on Ant Finance is going to mean for that access remains to be seen, because we don't know yet what that is, and Ant Finance is going to be being restructured. But this new fintech was truly it was a revolution, and I've seen it happen when I was living in Beijing. Whereas indeed 10 years ago there was no small and medium enterprise that will get a loan despite all the promotions from the government. That changed with fintech. So once the dust settles, we will see how far this is being pulled back.
My concern is exactly Ant Financial. I heard that the Ant Financial chief executive just resigned a couple of days ago. Goh Shuqing made a speech in Hong Kong in January saying that same business, same rules. In other words, if Ant Financial behaves like a bank, we will impose the same capital requirements on Ant Financial and so on. It's more like a process by which they are pulling back on some of these new players to be regulated in the same way as traditional banks. They make them part of the system. And the thing about the interbank lending market is that further downstream in that market, there are small financial institutions with credit problems and liquidity problems. Very interesting. I mean, for a country where the growth was at one time 12%, you do have a liquidity risk downstream, which are some of the financial factors that we need to get a good picture of how that's evolving, to get a sense of how credit is being disseminated and holding up the private sector, especially in the small business sector. And as we bank, the innovators have extended credit to the small enterprises. So it'll be interesting to see to what extent the intentions of these documents and the policies that come out in the next few years coagulate to continue that process, which has already started, the process of innovation and access to credit. Talk to us a little bit about the rural vitalization. Maybe John would have a very good feel of what's going on in the rural sector, and Bert as well, because you've actually lived in Beijing and you've seen yourself, the infrastructure part of the rural development is very clear to be seen today. The human capital part, what needs to be done. I noticed and there was one comment in the document saying that agriculture will become a smaller part of the overall GDP. I don't know what the number is, but it's quite dramatic the next 10 years or so. So as agriculture becomes less of the GDP, comprising less of the GDP's components, I think John mentioned food security. How is the rural community going to evolve in the next 5 to 10 years, you think?
I think this is very much from a President Xi's sort of a very strong personal preference. He has a strong inclusive agenda, and today's the poorest, the least the segment of the population that has the least benefited from the China's economic boom is the rural population. And the rural area has been sort of in neglect for a long time. I think mostly driven by people leaving the countryside. The younger generation, they don't go into the fields cultivating the soil anymore. They move to the city. They are looking for jobs. And in today's China, the people who are really sort of touring in the fields in the agriculture sector, these are people, in the 50s, 40s. Young people don't even know how to do agriculture anymore. I think there's a big problem. And on top of this, there's also China is trying to build the local infrastructures for the rural communities to close the gap between between local community, the rural and the urban communities. And you go to China, you immediately see the big difference. So that's what the government intends to do, to revitalize the rural communities, to invest in the local communities, and to, at the same time, beef up agriculture from a security perspective. So I would expect that China's going to make some big investment in this area, in both a soft infrastructure as well as hard infrastructure. That might be an investment opportunity.
So the number that I saw in the 2035 document is that in 2017, 27% of the workforce is in agriculture. In 2035, the document expects 6% of the workforce in agriculture. That's a dramatic shift. I'm sure there's productivity involved, there's machinization and so on, but that fundamentally transforms the rural landscape and the way in which it grows. So I'm just trying to imagine what that means in reality. 27% of workforce to 6% of workforce.
That's a quite large number, actually. It's even 1% decrease represents a very large population reduction in the rural area. But that's happening regardless of government's plan. I think one thing that's taking place right now in China's rural communities is the consolidation of cultivation, in my view. Right? I mean, in the old days, everybody does this little part of land and does himself his own cultivation. But now you're seeing more and more people consolidate the land, and they're not doing this anymore. They lease to someone who's doing this, and they're using machinery to do this. That's actually, it might be a quite significant structural change that calls for less labor input, more capital input. It also calls for technology input.
But you have a view, because you've seen several economies, not just China. When a country makes that kind of transition, what does that mean?
The 27% is too high. And so it's probably, statistically, there's some questions, but also China has already been heavily promoting agriculture by means of subsidies ever since the entry into the WTO, where agriculture prices went down. Food security became an issue, and China has been subsidizing it, the countryside, quite a bit. It has made massive investments over the past 10 years, in part as part of the anti-poverty drive, massive investments in rural infrastructure, which has been absolutely dramatic. And I literally went to the same village where I went first in 1992, when it took me almost 3 days to get there from Beijing. And now it took me 6 hours to get there. So just to give you an impression of how much that infrastructure has changed. But what has not happened, and I think President Xi is hoping of it, is to have new jobs move to the countryside. And here's something, John said something before, the competition is between cities, is between municipalities in China. They don't want to let go of a lot of infrastructure, so they continue to subsidize infrastructure, which in many countries would move far more to the rural areas. The second very problematic area is indeed education and overall service provision. And I think there the plan tries to make a big difference so that it's better to live in the countryside. But nevertheless, the quality differences in education between, say, rural Guizhou and Shanghai are just tremendous. It's like an African country and a European country. Those big differences. literally of an order of magnitude. And it's very hard to overcome that, frankly. So the one area where I think the rural areas have a comparative advantage is in aged care. China's population is aging. They do not necessarily want to stay in the cities, moving to the less expensive countryside. If there are communities that can absorb them, I think that would be a good growth area. But at the same time, I still see a movement of people from rural areas to urban areas. China is quite reluctant about that. Yes, they're moving on the hukou system, but the land rights attached to hukou is still an issue. Let's say there's still some contradictions there. It's not yet clear cut where exactly the policy should be.
Related to that is the whole discussion on income disparity over time. During the two meetings, I'm not sure which minister was mentioning that China has technically eradicated poverty, officially done that. And then there were questions as to what measurement did they use? Was that the UN or some of the other agencies, the IMF measurement and so on? But the real issue is, the technical definition just continues to be an issue, especially if there's income disparity going forward, right? Do you see that China is the one country that might be able to ameliorate that? Because, in the liberal capital economies, that's not going away. They're becoming highly financialized and, and the disparities. Bert, you'd like to speak to us?
Yes, China has eradicated extreme poverty at its own poverty line, which is quite comparable. As America is a bit higher than the international poverty line that the World Bank uses. So for the World Bank, China had already eliminated poverty by 2018. China now, according to its own poverty line, says extreme poverty is gone. And that's a great achievement, no question about it. But if you look at countries that are at China's level of per capita income, i.e. $10,000, you would not count with a poverty line of $2.20 in 2011 prices, but more like $6 or $8. If you look at the $6 and the $8 line, you still have 300, 400 million people in poverty in China. So in other words, it's not that everybody is suddenly middle class, not at all. Still a long way to go. Second, this rural-urban disparity is really very high. It is about 1 to 3 in China, and it has been a bit less in the 80s. It's been more in the 90s and the 2000s. Rural incomes are now growing more rapidly than urban incomes, but it's big. Second, it's not just income disparity, it's wealth disparity that is very big, because most urban citizens, they have a big chunk of wealth in their apartment or in their second apartment or in their third apartment if they've been smart. Rural citizens don't have that, and they have very incomplete rights on their land, which is the asset that they could potentially trade, but they don't have the right to benefit from the capital increase on that. So there's a big wealth disparity as well. And frankly, it's very hard to get sort of back on board, even if you now move as a migrant to urban areas, because the big capital gains were between the end of the 90s and now. I mean, the apartments in Beijing are now really, really very pricey. I wouldn't be able to afford it. There's other cities as well, of course, that where it's a bit less so. But to remove those disparities is very hard. What is normally a big engine of equalization is education. But again, there, the quality of rural education lags far behind that of urban education. So it's not altogether clear that there will be a rapid decrease in inequality between urban and rural areas, given the measures that are currently on the books.
Good point. Just for the sake of completeness, let's get back to the question of domestic consumption. I think the 2035 goal for domestic consumption is 60%, whereas the 2019 matrix was more like 39% of GDP. And from 39 to 60, that's almost a doubling. So what is domestic consumption comprised of? What is the profile? What is the scenario that we're looking at in order to see that come about? I noticed that during the pandemic, by the way, China increased the limits on, duty-free purchases, made Hainan a larger island, a larger, destination for. In fact, Hainan is now the world's largest duty-free destination. All the Europeans are lining up to be seen in Hainan and so on. But domestic consumption is far, far more than that. Is that domestic production and domestic consumption? Or is that internalization of imports? Give us a sense of what you think you see in these numbers.
Are you sure right now it's only 39%? I thought it's more than that.
That's household income, but maybe there is a confusion. Total income, including government consumption, it's already 52, 53%. So maybe it is from 53 to 60%. From 39 to 60%, frankly, that would not be possible. But household consumption is at 39% of GDP.
But in any case, we would really expect that the household consumption would increase significantly. So Daniel, you asked this question, what are these things are coming from? I would say 2 points. One is that the increased household consumption certainly will come from buying more expensive stuff, buying things of more high quality. That's definitely true. But I think it's going to be something more than that. For things that are not related to just products and goods. A lot of it actually, I would say, coming from the service side. High quality medical service, high quality education service, more travel overseas, vacations, stuff like that, and also in the cultural goods, all these things. So in these areas, I think there's a quite large potential. Today's China, consumption is more than just about. I think at this point it's more about better clothing, better food, these things, right? But I think in the future it's going to develop into something more than that. It's going to be more of a service component in my view. Second thing is about imports. I think there's going to be a huge potential for imports. Also working role at this point in terms of importing things from nice, good stuff from all over the world. Things really can sell on the Chinese market, right? I give you one example. E-commerce has enabled imports of coffee from Rwanda. How would you imagine that this could be possible in the past? You've never heard about coffee from Rwanda, but it's actually selling quite well in China. Alibaba set up a regional sort of a collection center in Rwanda, e-commerce center in Rwanda, helping local farmers to package things, put on the right label, and these things are being sold on e-commerce platform directly to Chinese consumers. So I think in summary, I would say service-oriented consumption is going to be a big part, and imports is going to be the next big part.
And I'm going to be throwing in some numbers, but something, and yes, there is a middle class in China that is growing, that has been driving consumption, because household consumption has been growing more rapidly than GDP, just not that much more rapidly than GDP. So that's why it slowly creeped up over the last decade from 36% of GDP to now 39% of GDP. But if you really want to make a major impact on this, you can only do 2 things. One is get a higher share of the pie of GDP to households, i.e. more rapid wage growth than GDP. Or second, get the savings rate of households down overall. Now, and despite all the encouragement of consumption, Chinese still save a lot, and everybody saves at every income level and even at every age level, even though there is a more distinct pattern there. But key among them is that the richest share, they save 50-60% of their income. whereas the lower income levels, they save 15, 20% of their income. So a redistribution between the two would help. Second, social safety net in China is still at a very low level. Yes, it's expanding. Pension is now covers 95% of people. Health insurance covers 95% of people. Dibao is 70 million people, but at very, very low levels of income. So you could imagine that government takes an active role in some redistribution through the budget, sponsoring the non-contributable pension, rural pension system from say 130 to 140 to double that or triple that, and you would get definitely more consumption. But you of course that requires sacrifices of others, i.e. somebody needs to pay the taxes for it. The second is to strengthen the overall social security, for instance, by devoting more dividends from state enterprises to the Social Security Fund, or giving the shares of state enterprises to the Social Security Fund, so that people say, oh, my pension is actually assured. It's much stronger now than I thought it was before, so I can consume a bit more. So there's a whole range of policies that would lead to a bit more equality. It would lead to a bit of a higher share of households in the overall pie, and a better division between, if you want, the state enterprises and the rest of the economy. So a lot of things to do there. Difficult things. They're not easy policy-wise, but they would all feed into higher consumption.
In fact, the taxation part, I would expect taxation to come down so that there will be more disposable income. But it will be interesting to see how that works out. And in terms of services, I mean, I need to pay insurance, which is very high. And I figure that's because it's not broad-based. If it was far more broad-based, it'll be, the rates will come down.
But taxation is very low in China. Taxation,
real effective taxation.
Overall taxes as a share of GDP is now 18%, 1/8. And that's down from 22% only 3-4 years ago. China has actually been reducing the taxation rate, the VAT, and especially taxation on small and medium enterprises. And it has been continuously keeping people out of the personal income tax. Deliberate policies, in part to stimulate, last year it was to stimulate the economy, but by now 18% of GDP is really quite low. Because there's lots of obligations that China also has taken on as a state. So I think taxation overall will come up. Personal income tax will be a bigger part of that. Yes, as a foreigner, I'm sure you pay a lot of personal income tax. You very easily hit the 45%, but the broad masses of the Chinese actually don't pay personal income tax, or hardly, except for the payroll taxes. The payroll taxes are quite high. Pension insurance in the formal system is really quite high. That's in part because there's very little returns on the investment that are being made. So again, lots of areas of reforms ahead to get to this modern socialist society in 2035.
To add to what you just said about taxation, there are objectives to be met for increased number of financial centers and tax havens in China. So that's an interesting objective that they put into the program, which is increasing the special economic zones for different purposes, right? So that's that. Okay, let's wrap up. Final thoughts from both of you, and then we'll wrap up. I think you've given us a very good range of issues to drill down into, and it's been a good conversation. Last thoughts, Bert, and then John.
The next 5 years are going to be quite critical for China, and to see how they move to this new development model, this dual circulation, how they get up research and development spending and become more innovative, contribute to more basic innovation. We haven't touched upon this at all yet. It's important for China for its long-term growth. So I look forward to tracking that.
And I want to say that this is sort of like a vision statement, a vision document, and it's very hard actually to go back and to compare what's really happened to what this vision is saying. So, but but overall, I think it determines basically. I think the real purpose is determines where the central government's budget money is going to go towards. There will be quite significant funds allocated for achieving some of these targets. But I think to be honest with you, I think the overall impact on where the China's economy is going to go towards it's going to be quite limited in my view. Because the economy has a huge inertia. It's going to run on its own, regardless of what the government does. I think overall China's economic growth is still, the engine is still growing. It's moving in a very good direction, and it's nice to see, as an ordinary citizen, that to see that President Xi is also emphasizing a lot of people relevant aspects of the new economic growth theory, as opposed to really just looking at the GDP growth figure. I think income distribution and returns of capital, returns on labor, these concepts do matter a lot actually in the future.
Thank you very much. In fact, I'll just add to that. When President Xi was proposing to, and actually now his leadership will continue for the foreseeable future. He didn't just, engineer it such that there's a continuity in government, but he also has put in this 2035 document, which says, here's the agenda. These are the things we're going to be working on. So, it focuses everybody on that. One area that we didn't cover in our conversation is really the global implications and the global issues that China will be facing. In fact, the top of mind right now is that the global cost of capital is the cheapest it's never been, and that's denominated in dollars. And China, as a effectively closed economy in terms of the current account convertibility, pays a high price of capital domestically, and it exports on that basis too. So the arbitrage of capital cost is something that I'm quite curious as to how that's going to work out over time. But somehow China has managed over the years, because of the trade engine, as trade decreases, and also in these two documents, it has already started to recognize that trade will become less of a driver as it was in the first 20 years since joining WTO. I think we've got a good range of issues for us to bear our minds on in terms of what to look out for as China puts in place the 14th five-year plan and the long-range objectives through the year 2035. Thank you, both of you. And I also note that Bert lived in China for about 12 years as the World Bank representative in Asia. So you're very, very familiar with China, and good to be talking to both of you because you know China well.